personnel. Okay. Next item on the agenda is regarding the adoption of CSA PCP-09 for the certification of exposure device operators that outline CMD 14M43 and 14M43.A. I'd like to acknowledge Ms. Karine Fahy, that she's online. Is that correct?
Yes,
CSA?
I am. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, welcome. So I'll turn now the floor to CNSC, and I understand Monsieur Regimbal, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et bonjour, membres de la Commission. Je m'appelle André Regimbal, je suis le directeur général responsable de la réglementation des substances nucléaires. With me today are Mr. Henry Rabsky, Director of the Operations Inspection Division, Mr. Chuck McDermott, Special Advisor in the Directorate of Safety Management, and Ms. Kathleen Heppel-Massey, Director General of the Directorate of Safety Management. I'd also like to thank the representative from the Canadian Standards Association joining us by video conference. And there are also representatives from the industrial radiography industry, and also a colleague from Natural Resources Canada present with us today, who all took part in the development of this important initiative. So the CMD provides an update with respect to the certification process for exposure device operators in Canada. Exposure device operators provide an important service to the industrial sector across Canada, in particular non-destructive testing of essential infrastructure and materials fabricated for industry by using a radiation device approved by the CNSC, which contains a radioactive source. CNSC staff has worked closely with industry over the past several years to update the current exposure device operator certification requirements, and will be presenting a summary of the key elements of the new operator certification guide, known as Canadian Standards Association PCP-09, that will be replacing the current CNSC guide document G229 in the coming months. So I'd like to now turn it over to Mr. Rabsky and Mr. McDermott, who will be making the presentation on behalf of their respective directorates. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the Commission. The presentation of the new guide, PCP-09, will begin with an overview of how the current certification process evolved and the reasons why CNSC staff and industry stakeholders initiated, with the help of the Canadian Standards Association, the development of the guide known now as PCP-09. PCP-09 takes into account current regulatory, safety and security requirements for the safe operation of exposure devices. With the publication of the guide by the CSA, CNSC staff has developed a plan to adopt the guide over the coming months, recognizing the need to transition the industry so that exposure device operators are not negatively impacted as the guide takes effect. As you can see in this slide, industrial radiography equipment has evolved from the first devices used for performing radiography, known as handheld fish poles, to the more modern and safer self-contained apparatus like the ones shown on this slide. They are examples of typical exposure devices that are certified by the CNSC and used by licensees. The portable exposure devices displayed in these photos would typically contain an iridium-192 source with activity up to 5.5 terabecquerels and weigh in the order of 25 kilograms. They are also certified as Type B packages by the CNSC and are designed to withstand severe accident conditions during transport. In this slide here, we're presenting a cross-sectional view of a typical exposure device known as the QSA Global 880 model. Several key components of an exposure device are highlighted. The source is attached to what is known as a source holder. The tube through which the source traveled is S-shaped, as seen in the diagram, and shielded by dense material to attenuate the radiation from the source and limit exposure when the source is not in use. The assembly to which the source is secured to is manipulated by an external drive cable 10 to 15 meters in length. The manipulation of the source is performed by a crank attached to the end of the drive cable. Radiography is very much like taking an X-ray of the human body to identify the bones and even internal organs. Instead of using an X-ray machine, a radioactive source which has sufficient energy to penetrate the object is used to examine and produce an image on a photographic film. The object you want an image of must be placed between the radioactive source and the photographic film. The radioactive source is exposed for a period of time sufficient for the gamma rays to penetrate the object and create an image on the film. When done, the radioactive source is shielded, the film is developed, and can be interpreted by a technician. To provide the Commission with a perspective of the radiography industry, currently there are 111 radiography companies licensed to operate across Canada by the CNSC. The majority of the licensees are located in Western Canada. The company structures are varied since they typically perform a variety of other services for the industrial sector involving non-destructive testing. In Canada, the companies range from small to large multinationals. They are organized through branches or regional offices that can typically be set up across provinces as well as across the country to provide services to industrial facilities throughout. For the information of the Commission, there are currently 16 device models certified by the CNSC, and there are approximately 1,065 devices that are available to operate across Canada by exposure device operators. Challenges faced by the operators of exposure devices are varied and sometimes unique to the specific job they are tasked to perform. As demonstrated in this slide, the working conditions are typically less than ideal, subject to change in weather conditions, and can often be performed in locations such as a confined space or a significant elevation above ground. I'd like to briefly provide the Commission a background regarding our certification process at the CNSC. Back in 1974, the Atomic Energy Control Board decided that radiography device operators needed some type of certification comparable with other non-destructive certification that existed at that time. It was decided to follow the Canadian General Standards Board ISO standard 9712. In 1983, the AECB then decided to increase the expectation of operating exposure devices due to the risk posed to workers and the environment, creating what was known as the Qualified Operator Certification. This involved the AECB conducting examinations of potential operators and the issuance of a certificate. In 1997, the CNSC transferred the administration of the exam to NRCan and continued on its own motion to issue the certificates. With the passage of the NSCA Act in 2000, the Exposure Device Operator Certification became a regulatory requirement under the Act, specifying requirements for the safe operation to the expectations that were identified at that time. These expectations were subsequently published as a regulatory guide known as G229. CNSC staff updated the Commission from time to time with respect to the incidents involving the performance of radiography, and in 2009 initiated a working group comprised of industrial representatives, CNSC staff, to advance the safe operation of the industrial radiography. The working group put together a strategy to improve safety in the industry and identified at that time that G229 needed to reflect those expectations along with the changes to the regulatory regime that took place over time. The task of developing the guidance document was given to the CSA, which had a long-standing relationship with the CNSC, supporting standards used in nuclear power reactors, as well as the expertise in developing certification requirements in other comparable regulatory regimes. The CSA approach to engage key stakeholders was accomplished with the creation of a scheme committee in June 2011. Job task analysis was initiated, and meetings of technical groups resulted in a draft version of PCP-09 containing knowledge and skills expectation, a proposed examination evaluation for new exposure device operators, and a recertification requirements for current CEDOs. So why did we need to go under change? Since it was initially published in 2004, G229 had not been revised, even though CNSC regulations and expectations with respect to the safe operation of exposure devices had changed over that period. In addition, security measures for the storage and use of devices were enhanced, and all the changes needed to be reflected in the current certification guide. In addition, the number of incidents involving the devices indicated that there was a need to place more emphasis on improving the safety culture in the industry. Finally, the certification issued to CEDOs was indefinite, that is to say, no expiry or renewal requirements for the operators, raising concerns within the industry as well as the regulator as to how operators were maintaining their proficiency in the continued safe operation of these devices. PCP-09 describes a systematic process for a candidate to follow to achieve certification as an exposure device operator. The knowledge and skill requirements are described in the document, along with the various evaluations and testing that will need to be performed when conducting the on-the-job training component of the program. For the vocational institutions and licensees, guidance is provided with respect to the knowledge fundamentals to be addressed regarding radiation fundamentals, measurement, radiation safety, regulatory expectations, security requirements, and safe operational procedures. PCP-09 also describes how an exposure device operator can maintain his or her certification after the certification period of 5 years expires. Expectations are specified for continuous training, minimal practical experience requirements, and the retesting as part of the recertification requirements. The process developed PCP-09 utilized the experience of industry and other key stakeholders with the formation of a scheme committee. The committee provided essential input into the verification of the key tasks performed by the exposure device operator and what became the basis of the guide and the certification evaluation. CNSC throughout the process conducted significant outreach to ensure that the industry was engaged, participated in the technical working groups, and provided feedback throughout the development of the guide. CSA also brought in their psychometric experts from Criterion Global Testing to facilitate the task analysis and the exam development. Over a period of 18 months, the scheme committee met and developed a draft guide document by November 2013. The job task analysis performed by the scheme committee technical group identified the necessary knowledge and skills needed to operate an exposure device safely. In addition, the new examination to evaluate candidates was developed through workshops involving experts from within the industry and representation from the CNSC and other regulatory bodies. A bank of questions was developed to evaluate the candidates against the expectations described in PCP-09. The Scheme Committee has worked with the CSA since 2012 to evaluate, or what the terminology calls beta test, the question bank against the new expectations identified in the guide to ensure that a fair and transparent exam will be put in place to evaluate new candidates. At this point, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Mr. Chuck McDermott.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Commission members. So on this slide here, you'll see a comparison between what is in place today in G229 and what will take place once PCP-09 is brought into effect. So for every requirement, there's what's either not in place now and what would be in place in the future, or what's changed. For the most part, not very much has changed. And I won't talk anymore about what's in G229, but I'll move on to the next slide and talk about what will be required to become a CEDO under PCP-09. So the first thing that someone will have to do is pass an NRCan math test or some demonstrate equivalency. This is a new requirement, and we found that over time a number of mistakes were made in the field due to mathematical errors. So hopefully we'll catch some of those things earlier on. So if the next requirement is continuous education, that's for current CEDOs. But if we talk about becoming a CEDO, right now you have to do 320 hours of apprenticeship, and that continues in the future. The practical exam, it has to be done. There is a practical exam now. That practical exam is not much different going forward. What has changed is a new written exam. Right now there's a written exam with 60 multiple choice questions and a couple of essay questions. Going forward, there's a new exam which right now will consist of 148 multiple choice questions. The exam will still be administered by Natural Resources Canada, and instead of being written before the apprenticeship as it is now, it'll be written after the apprenticeship. And as mentioned earlier, certification is valid for 5 years. For renewal of certification, there are 2 requirements that are being introduced. The first is a requirement for 40 hours of continuous education over the 5-year period. We're quite flexible on what that is. We haven't been very prescriptive in what that is. It can include safety briefings, it can include new equipment, the sort of things that licensees are expected to and do on a regular basis now. The other requirement is that they actually perform radiography in the field for 320 hours over the previous 2-year period. There is an alternative that's offered, and that is to write the exam again. Also, we're expecting that for every renewal of certification, you'll have to pass a practical exam again. So how will these roles and responsibilities be divided among the various organizations? So the commission staff, we do oversight of that, and we continue to issue the certification to exposure device operators. Natural Resources Canada does 2 important jobs on our behalf. The first is they verify the candidate activity in a process similar to how you would go about getting a passport. And they also administer the written exam on behalf of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission through their extensive network of test centers across Canada. The Canadian Standards Association, they do the independent standards development, and they will oversee a scheme committee that will be assessing the effectiveness of PCP-09 going forward. We expect that committee to meet annually. Industry also doesn't get off the hook. They are expected to ensure that their CEDOs meet PCP-09 and that they provide knowledge and skill development. They are responsible for administering the practical exam. That's no different than today. And of course, if they have any feedback on the standard, we expect to receive that through the scheme committee or through the development process. So how are we going to roll this out? Our expectation is that we'll be able to require or offer certification under PCP-09 effective the 1st of November 2014. We have ongoing outreach to CEDOs, licensees, and trainers that has been going on over the last 2 years to do this. That will continue. The transition to the new process, so people who are in progress right now will have the option of doing the certifying under G229 or certifying under PCP-09 until the 1st of March 2015. Effective March 1st, 2015, the only way that that designated officers will certify someone will be if they followed PCP-09. Also, the first renewals of certification come up in March 2015. So we gave updates at the spring meetings in May 2014, and we will give new updates May 2015. In due course, CNSC Reg Doc 2.2.3 personnel certification will be updated to include the requirements in PCP-09. So in conclusion, the certification of CEDOs is updated with a continuous emphasis on safety and security. PCP-09 will ensure a periodic review with the establishment of a review committee, which will be managed by the CSA on our behalf. Industry supports these changes to the certification process and have in fact been instrumental in driving some of the changes. The new examination is completely computer-based and should result in quicker turnaround time for results. And we believe that there is some impact on current CEDOs and licensees, but that impact is minimal. And staff is available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you.